Hi everyone, I'm Katie Roach and today we're at the Grow and Learn Community Garden and we will be pruning some tomatoes and practicing the Florida weave to get our tomato vines up off the ground. One reason it's important to get our tomato vines off the ground is to promote good airflow and to reduce potential for disease vectors because less of the plant will be touching the ground. It'll also make it easier to harvest and to maintain your tomatoes if they're a little bit higher up to where you can reach them and see them, and it'll keep them from becoming a tomato jungle. If you spend maybe at least one time a week Florida weaving your tomatoes, then you'll get to avoid spending an hour wrangling really long tomato vines back into where they need to be, and it'll just make it a lot easier for you to manage in the future. And trellising upward if you're gardening in a small space also helps a lot because you're in a limited space, and so you might want more space for other veggies. So we're going to get into Florida weaving some tomatoes. The two things you're going to need for this are some tomato twine and some scissors or pruning snips to cut the tomato twine. So we'll get into it. One more thing, when you are Florida weaving your tomato vines, you'll want to start kind of as soon as you plant them. Really, you can add a layer of twine just to kind of keep them from falling onto the ground. And then you'll want to continue adding layers of twine every 4 to 6 inches as they grow. So essentially, we'll just be sandwiching our tomato vines between these 2 layers of twine. So we're not actually taking this and tying it around the vine itself. We're just going to put it on either side of it to just kind of support it growing upward. And this will just kind of help train the tomatoes to grow up and grow in a vertical instead of horizontal. All right, so the first thing I want to do is take my twine and then just pull it out about as far as the T-post is and give yourself a little bit of extra room on both sides. Make it a little bit longer than how far apart your T-posts are spread because you'll need to tie knots on either end. So if I'm just adding one single row on this side, I'm just going to cut a piece of twine. But I could also pull it out longer and go ahead and wrap it around this post like that and then come back and connect it to the other side. But sometimes it's a little bit easier if I'm having to wrangle the tomatoes to just do one solid stretch. So that's what we're going to be doing. So cut down there. You'll make your first tie down kind of low. We'll tie it here and tie it there. So these plants are already laying on the ground. Ideally, I'd want to kind of add that first layer before they're on the ground, just so I don't have to wrangle them as much. But we'll go ahead and add this first layer on the bottom. And then I like to also kind of wrap and pull on this last one just to keep the tension in my twine. And then I'm just tying another knot and keeping that tension on the other side. So now that I've got my first edge in, we'll go ahead and we'll do our second. And this is where it gets a little bit, like sometimes it might be good to have an additional person outside with you just to have them help you put the vines in between the 2 rows of twine, but we can also do that by ourselves. So we'll lift this vine up, try to catch one of its branches, maybe right here, and it'll just kind of be a sandwich in between. But as we keep adding twine, this tomato is going to kind of correct back up. And then I'm reaching the end, so I will wrap it, pull it nice and taut, and then I will wrap this around the end a couple of times. All right, we'll add one more layer of twine right now, and then we'll kind of speed it up and get to the end of our process. So I'm coming up about maybe 6-ish, 4 to 6 inches for my second layer of twine. Tying that off, running it down the side, giving myself a little bit of extra space. and tying it through. So then maybe I'll start on this side this time. Add another piece of twine. Cut it to have some extra. And then we're going to go around this other side and pull our tomato plant back up. Kind of catch that in between that stem with our twine. And you don't need to wrap it this many times. You can cut it shorter. That's just kind of how the cookie crumbled in this case. So the main thing I'm doing is just keep making sure I keep enough tension for with the twine, but notice how I'm not wrapping the stems. I'm literally just sandwiching this stem in between this twine. One thing you might notice, this tomato is definitely shorter than this tomato, and that's okay. Well, as this tomato gets larger, you can just kind of scoot that twine back and kind of guide it up back through. All right, so ideally, when doing the Florida weave, I would probably have tomatoes that are the same variety, so they're growing at the same rate. So I might have 2 tomatoes that are this tall, or 3, depending on how far apart your posts are spaced. And that'll just kind of make it easier for you to Florida weave. So like we've got this guy that's so short, we'll have to kind of move this sandwich back to lead him up. But if I were replanting, I would definitely plant tomatoes that are going to grow about the same height. The next thing I want to talk about is pruning tomatoes. So when you're pruning the tomatoes that you've planted, once they kind of reach a pretty good height, you'll want to start pruning all of the bottom foliage off. And I'm actually going to wait on this tomato, but eventually we'll prune him some. But you can already see that this tomato doesn't have any foliage all along the lower part of its stem. And you actually want to remove up to 18 inches of foliage from the very bottom. And that's just going to help with your disease resistance, not resistance, but just with it being less susceptible to plant diseases because there's less leaf area for dirt to splash back up on it during a rain event or when you're watering. And I also already noticed that this tomato is setting some fruit, and if it was a little bit shorter, I'd want to cut that off as well. And so here I'm going to go ahead and just cut off this fruit because I really want this tomato plant to focus on growing instead of producing seed and producing fruit. The next thing you want to be cognizant with your tomatoes is not letting them get too many suckers too quickly. So I like to prune off all of the suckers that are kind of on these lower branches. And here we've got one that's already kind of above that 18-inch mark. So I might keep it, but you can tell it's a sucker because we've got our branch that's right here, kind of pointing downwards a little bit, or maybe horizontal. And in the armpit between the main stem, which is here, and this branch, then we've got another main stem that's attempting to form, and that is a sucker. So it's just basically trying to become another main stem. So you can treat it as such and kind of lead it up as well. And if you've got main stems and you've got suckers, treat them both kind of the same. So you're wanting to prune. If I have a sucker that's closer to the bottom, I'm going to prune off its foliage as well. And you can remove up to 33% of the tomato plant's foliage in one setting without it shocking the plant. So as I'm pruning tomato foliage, I will mostly prune branches that are low to the ground, that are touching the ground, and sometimes I'll prune off any other branches I see that might not be producing fruit. So, or not might not be producing fruit and also are not shading fruit. So if I had a fruit cluster that was, say, like right here, I'm going to keep this foliage here so it's shading that fruit. But I definitely want to remove the lower foliage. You'll notice right now the tomatoes are kind of in the middle of this garden bed, and I'm standing on a board to help distribute my weight across the garden bed, so that way I'm not compacting the soil from just standing in one place. And I think that's incredibly helpful as you're building your soil to not compact it. The last thing I'll talk about too is this is my garden bed, I'd want to get in a good hardy layer of straw pretty early, and that's also going to help with kind of some of those disease issues and dirt splashback. So you can put that straw all the way up to the stem of the tomato, and that'll kind of help with some of that splashback. This tomato plant here, it's a little crinkly in some places. I'm going to be watching it for any potential signs of disease. If I am pruning tomatoes and I notice that one of my tomatoes might have a disease issue, I'm going to save that tomato for the very last to prune and to work with and touch, because I don't want to cross-contaminate my other tomatoes with whatever diseases those tomatoes might have. So that's why I kind of waited before pruning this one after I had pruned this one. Another good practice is to make sure you wash your tools after you're pruning your tomatoes. It's a good practice to have every time you're in the garden. Take your tools inside, wash them off with soap and water, maybe do a bleach concentrate spray, and just get them real good and clean, so next time you're out in the garden, you don't have to worry about cross-contaminating your other plants with plant diseases. So that's where we're at right now. This tomato is going to keep growing up. We'll see what that one does, and hopefully it'll start producing some fruit. It's already got another flower cluster forming here. Main takeaway, just remember, you're kind of pruning your suckers and just keeping it. You want to be able to see the area behind you if you're looking through tomato plants. You don't want a wall of vegetation, and adding these inches of twine every 4 to 6 inches at least one day a week will really save you some work and having to wrangle massive tomato vines. So this is a lot easier to manage than when we had to prune these guys up one day and they needed a lot of twine and their branches were growing everywhere, but we got them up. It did take 2 hours, so save yourself some time and do it sooner rather than later. One last thing I forgot to mention when you're Florida weaving is these posts are at least 6 feet tall, and that's because your indeterminate tomatoes are going to keep growing throughout the entire season. If you've got a determinate or a semi-determinate tomato, they're going to have a totally different growth habit, and they're probably going to stay about up to here, and you might just be able to put a stick next to them, a taller stick, and just tie them to that stick with a soft material like pantyhose or a cut up t-shirt or something like that. But you can use this same practice for determinate tomatoes, but this is really good for indeterminate ones that are going to keep producing up until some people will have up until the first frost if their tomato plants are healthy and they keep going. So really good for indeterminate tomatoes. The ones over here I think are Romas. They're semi-determinate, so they'll probably grow to about here, but you can still Florida weave those as well. That might be why this one is so short. It could be a determinate or a semi-determinate, while this one is definitely an indeterminate tomato. So this is our video. We talked about Florida weaving and pruning tomatoes.